I do think in society we have a fundamental problem with identity.
Mm. There is definitely a fundamental. Well, I guess the definition of identity itself is very well, it can be, I don't say misinterpreted, but it can be interpreted in a number of different ways to different people. Because some people
Mm.
will take a whole personality as their identity. You know, I am this person, that's me. I'm just the way I am. Other people will take it for, I don't know, being a gym bro or, another personality. And I think everyone goes through phases of that. But I think the biggest one that everyone can
Mm.
identify with, pardon the pun on that one, is jobs. You know, people
But
can. We need to start putting some sound effects in these. We'll have to. I need to just have a few more listens so we can start justifying the cost of sound effects. But what I was going to say
absolutely.
though was that the biggest identity that people have is jobs. They see jobs as their whole identity, and I can definitely think of times where I've done that. You know, for the last 5 or 10 years, it was like, this is all I wanted to be, and this is what I'm going to be doing. And I think there are some people out
Mhm.
there who can, wake up and be like, that is what I'm going to do. But I think for a lot of people, that doesn't necessarily resonate. And I think a lot of those people, in some ways for society, feel a little lost because they're not doing, the big thing that they're meant to be doing. And actually, maybe not everyone has that one big thing.
Coming back to that idea of your jobs and identity, I think it's so difficult to navigate that in our society because often people, when they meet you, when they first come into contact with you, the first question out of their mouth when they're trying to make small talk is, what are you? What do you do? That's the default. And then because of the way that humans think, we code things in schemas. So we categorize a person in that sort of schema, and we have a series of stereotypes or pieces of information associated with that particular label. So, for instance, we might go, oh, you're an accountant. Oh, so you're very particular, very litigious. And that's an assumption that we make about that person. And equally, that person going through meeting other accountants, living in a certain way that accountants might live. I don't know, I'm making a lot of generalizations here, but it goes, I'm an accountant, that is me.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore their schema that they've got in their mind is coded a certain way.
Yeah, very much so. But your point, you're saying, this is just me, that's your perception. That is societal in a way, isn't it? That we have these perceptions of certain career types and individuals who, they progress through because they are a certain type. I can think of the industries that I've worked in where engineers are notoriously told they're introverts. Well, you must be an introvert. You're an engineer. You like the detail, the analytics, time by yourself. Or, oh, well, you're a project manager. Well, you're an extrovert. You have to be an extrovert. And actually, I personally took that in a way as my personality. I was like, oh, yeah, I'm a big extroverted person. And actually, the more I studied it, more and moved into leadership, I realised that actually there's an element of me that is a bit extroverted, but actually I'm a lot more central than that. Whereas I've seen a couple of people that I work with who are incredibly good at delivering projects as well, but they lead completely from more of an emotional side of things and are more introverted. And so actually, I think these categories that we place people in for jobs can be quite misleading and generalised in a way.
In my opinion, I'd go a bit further. I'd say they're completely misguided. And I think as a person, as people, we can actually become, rather than having our own identity, we can become other people's perception. And you're forever changing depending on who you meet. And then when you come away from those familiar boundaries that you've been living in for, I don't know, 5, 10 years or 3 years or however long it is, you get so used to playing a certain role that when you go somewhere else, you do something different. You're like, who am I? What's going on? That's very jarring for so many people. And I remember once when I was 16, I read a really, really fascinating book. It's a cult classic, and it's a bit extreme in some of its takes, but it's called The Dice Man. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I haven't.
I recommend this book, not from a point of this is pure psychology or kind of a study of personality, but it's just interesting, the point that he's making. And he basically, it's about a psychiatrist who is so bored in life and he's really successful. He's hit the top of his bracket, if you like. He's gone as far as he can go. And he's in the middle of inventing a new theory around personality and roles and things like that. And he basically, in the story, says, well, when we're playing a role, another aspect of our life becomes dissatisfied. It falls away, and that leads to this inattention and frustration that causes distress.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm playing, and the character's name's Luke Reinhardt, and he goes, when I'm playing Luke Reinhardt, the father, my role as the psychiatrist becomes frustrated because I'm not doing what I want to do. And so he talks about it from this multifaceted dimension of personality, basically. And so he comes up with rolling dice to be able to fulfill different roles and to do different choices so that he can fulfill all the facets of his personality. Now, that leads to different moral dilemmas, different challenges, all sorts of inappropriate scenes. And remember, this book is quite satirical and very much of its time. But what I really like about it is that it really draws the distinction that people are multifaceted. You're 3D. There are more angles to you than you can really begin to count. And by categorizing yourself, what you're in effect beginning to do is stunt yourself. And that's very much what this book is trying to begin to show people. And in his desperation to break out of that 2D categorization and become more 3D, more full, he gets into a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble.
That's fascinating, actually. That really reminds me as well of, that point of what he's trying to play all these different personalities, different people. That actually there's the inverse of that as well as how other people see you, because you're thinking this is how society sees me. But I remember doing an exercise, a feedback kind of session called Johari's Window. And basically what you get is you get a load of these words that are kind of preset, and you issue this out as feedback to people. But you also do it yourself. And what was really interesting is around probably 2/3, 3/4 of my traits did match up with what other people said. But there are a number of other things that people had picked up on that maybe, I was, words that I wouldn't have necessarily used to describe myself. And so I think what I'm saying to people is, A, do that because it's a really good feedback loop, but also that it's important that some of the frames and the concepts in your mind that you're trying to live up to may not actually be how people see you anyway.
Just to, I suppose, add to that for people that aren't aware of what Johari's window is, it basically is literally a diagram of a window almost, and you have, I suppose, different titles for spots in this window. So in the top left corner, you have an open area that everyone can see, so it's known to you and known to others, and then you have a blind spot which is not known to others, and I suppose maybe known to you. And it's a really, really important exercise, I think, to do, because as you said, it can show you that perception of what other people have of you, and it can also show you where you might be off the mark when how you're seeing yourself. And often I've had that with clients where they come across and they say, I'm very confident, and I have to hold a bit of a mirror up. I'm like, well, that's not how I necessarily see you in these sessions. And so it can be a very difficult thing to do, because effectively what you're beginning to do is you're taking all the things that you didn't know about yourself and bringing them into broad daylight, or vice versa, or whatever it might be. And so do it with caution, because it can really hurt.
It can be uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable, can't it, actually? But it's I think there's a bigger narrative that sits beside or behind that in a way, because we can often assign this responsibility to these roles. Go, well, that is me. That is what I do. I am that person. And I can think of it as well. When I was thinking of stepping back from this kind of element of career, I was reflecting on it, because there was a lot of discomfort, being like, well, I've worked so hard on this, and everyone's seen me grow, and they all go, well, what's next? You're doing this. So there's these societal pressures in my head that I've now this title, now this person, I've got to keep moving through. And actually, when I started to really sit back and work through it, I realised that it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And that was in itself really uncomfortable, because it was like, well, hold on, I've built everything around me to head in this direction, not necessarily a job role, but to move into this trusted advisor space in a certain industry. And actually, I've now attained it, and I've been practicing at a very professional level for several years now. And I've kind of got to the point where I go, actually, is this what I want? Something's not quite aligning. And I think many people can I would say, I think a lot of people can probably resonate with this, that we sometimes sit in those spaces because you go, well, I can't get out of this situation. I can't leave this job. And actually that element of discomfort, which we talked about before, builds that awareness piece. But then actually, I think you sometimes do need to take that action. It is important to step back and go, hold on a second. Is this really what I want to be doing?
Well, I think you actually hit on a really, really important thing there. So let's open up a bit more. We're talking about going from what we would call role salience, this idea of being completely congruous with your professional identity, social identity, or however you want to frame it, be it a job, be it a hobby, be it a particular informal role, fatherhood, motherhood, being an uncle, being a brother, to what we call role conflict, which is where, for some reason, maybe a change in values, maybe an event's happened that's really shaped you or changed how you see the world, and you've come into conflict with that previous roles where you were in the middle of holding it quite nicely. Well, this is who I am, to be like, well, I don't know who I am at the moment. I'm changing. I'm going through a transition. What do you do when you can't escape? How do you ride that distress out? Because that role conflict is uncomfortable for a lot of people. My advice, that's a time for experimentation. Try and find joy in other things while you're trying to navigate that tricky area. Try and find meaning in other activities. Maybe like what we do podcasting, we read books, we do all sorts of things. And it's thinking about that doesn't have to be the only space in which you operate. So your job doesn't necessarily have to be your meaningful occupation. And that's a term that a lot of OTs use, because that's largely what their role is focused around, helping people engage with things that they find meaningful, their everyday activities. And you have to begin to think, well, what everyday activities can I engage with that aren't this particular thing that I can't change at the moment? And I think that's a really important thing to begin to draw out, because so many of the people that might be listening to what we're saying are going to feel completely stuck. I can't give up this job just yet because I've got bills to pay. I can't do this because I've got kids. I can't do this because so on and so forth. So it's thinking about that very broadly. And I suppose naming that there's going to be so many people who are going to hear what we're saying and be like, it's not easy to change. And you're absolutely right. It's not. We're never going to pretend like it is.
No, it's really not. But also that's not a reason for staying in that position. That discomfort we've talked about a lot is that in itself. You have to go through that element, right? You have to go. Change is not comfortable, right? And actually, I think a lot of people would say this, looking back, is that they wish they kind of made a decision sooner. And so I think there is that kind of two bits that you're picking up there, where one, can you do something about it now? Make a definitive change. I'm in a very privileged position that I was able to do that, and I stepped back, worked my notice period out, and I'm now in a cleaner space, and I've got a bit of runway ahead of me before I've got to make a decision, right? Other people aren't going to be in that luxurious position. So actually your point there, just to really pick up on it for people, is finding meaning, in the little things, whether that is just going for a walk after work and just switching off completely, or it is watching your favorite show, or doing something meaningful to you, and then help build those other elements of your life. Because I think for a lot of people, nowadays, we can't say, oh, we're doing this job because it's the only thing I love, right? Because actually there's these other pressures that a lot of society has placed on people, of mortgages, debt, and other things, and that's a whole different discussion, right? But a lot of people are having to move up these ladders, or having to take these jobs to be able to afford an element of lifestyle that has not necessarily for their own thought of their own, but they've got to try and sustain. And so actually, before you start tearing everything down, starting with some of those smaller, meaningful things for you can give you a bit of relief from that. Because I think for me particularly, it makes me feel a bit sick just thinking about the idea of being stuck and not having options. That is probably a really tough place for people to be.
It's a scary place, isn't it? And I think coming on to that idea of being stuck, because I think we see it everywhere nowadays. You might talk to someone and they go, well, I've tried applying for different jobs. I've tried doing this and it's always been a rejection. And I think that stuckness can erode your sense of self and actually play into this idea. So I think it can further this idea of role salience unhelpfully. So you try and apply for jobs, or you try and move on, or you try different projects and ventures and they don't work out. And as a result, you then go, oh, well, I guess all I am is an
X.
accountant. And I keep coming back to accountants. All I am is the postman. All I am is the pilot. Whatever the role might be. And you almost take those rejections as evidence. And I would say be very cautious when you're appraising things. And like using the Johari window or the maintenance cycle that we spoke about. How are you processing that evidence of that rejection? How are you experiencing that? And how is that maybe furthering this idea of role salience, that you are just this one singular thing? Because you're never just one thing. And you hear it all the time, don't you? When you talk to someone in your setting or office and they go, oh, I'm just the cleaner. Oh, I'm just the assistant. Oh, I'm just the clinical psychologist. Oh, I'm just this. You're never just anything. There's so much more to you. And I think that's such an important thing to take away.
So important, right? Because those titles I've talked about leadership without title and all these different things, but titles are irrelevant in many ways, right? They're there for that societal kind of meaning, but actually they don't need to define you. I can think of many people that I work alongside, and I've never once gone, oh, they're only an assistant or they're only a senior. They don't. That's an element of understanding where they are in their progress, but it doesn't really define them. And the bit with work, it's very easy for that to become a lot of people's identities. And you talk about trying and applying for different roles and jobs, but I think it's very hard for people to go, actually, I'm just going to change, because there's no guarantee. That point of applying to these jobs and getting all these rejections, right? But all it takes is one of those to pay off. And, I really live by this now, but the only time you actually fail is when you give up or you don't try. That's actually the only time you fail.
And I think using that language that you were just using a moment ago, when you notice yourself saying only and just those are some of the most corrosive terms to use in context of your identity. Because what it does is it minimizes you. And a bit like Patrick Swayze says, nobody puts baby in a corner. Get out of the corner, because that's what you're doing to yourself. You have to see yourself more than just a cog in a machine. And I think as listeners, the trap, and not just as listeners, as a person, the trap that you can sometimes fall into being an employee working in a big organization is that it can take all your energy. And the best form of resistance to that is focusing on those other areas that bring you meaning. And I'm not just talking these altruistic ideas like helping others or big things, big gestures. Because obviously when we say things like that, people sometimes think, oh, I've got to go big or not bother at all. No, you don't. It can literally just be something small, like you're going to pull up one weed in your garden. You're going to read a page of your favorite book. You're going to maybe skate down the road. Whatever the thing is that gives you meaning, start small. And that's what builds change. Those incremental, consistent changes. And that will help you, I suppose, weather some of that stuckness in your role, in your job, whatever it is.
That's so true, right? And we talked about the last episode about a little bit of consistency, because we've talked about this singular definition of, okay, I am that person. Well, I think that's a lot of comfort for people, because that unknown side is a lot of discomfort in a way. I don't know how I'm going to change, or I don't know what to do, and that's what we're trying to do here for listeners, is help people with giving them some tools that can help them live more intentionally, right? Build that awareness piece, because we aren't these singular things. We're not robots. We're not specifically designed to produce X or do Y. Some people are very lucky. They wake up and they go, I'm going to be a doctor. And they go and do that. And that's who they are. And they just progress through life, right? But not everyone's going to attain that. And so that point that you're saying, just little bits that work for you, mine's cooking. That was a solace. I remember going through the work, going to the job, doing 8 to 10 hours a day and feeling knackered. And for a few weeks, I was sitting there and it just drained me. And I suddenly realised I'd done nothing else apart from work. I'd literally got up to go to work to then rest because I was too tired for work. And I was like, I can't be in this space. This isn't healthy. It's not, work doesn't define who I am. And so I started just cooking, just really focusing on food again, cooking and other things. And it's very easy for me to sit in this position now and say that, right? But that was October, November last year, when I started thinking of this, and we're now recording this in early May. So I'm not saying for anyone that this is the defined period of time that it will take for you to move through these spaces. But to your point, you have to start small, because actually you can't always make these immediate changes, and you can't always see when that change is going to happen. And I think that's what prevents a lot of people from doing anything, is that they can't see when it's going to happen.
Sometimes you just gotta have a little faith. And coming back to that example of people, I don't know, they wake up one day, they go, maybe in primary school, their parents have said you're going to be a doctor, so they hold on to that idea and they're like, I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to be a lawyer, or I'm going to be a policeman. Even these people who have found a career that they want to spend their whole life in, even these people have moments where they go, this isn't all I want to be. And that's just normal. That's just life. And I don't believe that there's any one person who goes, my job is everything to me and it's the only thing. Unless you're maybe trying to run away from something. But there will be other moments of solace that they go and look for. Maybe it's gardening. Maybe it's wrestling in the mountains. Who knows? Whatever it is. And this is what I mean. The world is so big. Yeah. The world is so wide. You don't have to do extreme things. But there will be something that you go and find that is more than your job. And I think that's the side of a life coming into that 3D perspective, opposed to that 2D perspective. You begin to see the world in multiple tones and angles, rather than that 2D black and white picture. You're not a drone, and that's something you have to think about.
So true. It's so true. And it's easy to get lost in that. I now try and look at it in a simple sense of kind of what I do for work, my health, and then kind of like family and relationships and friendships. And I find that as long as I can try and keep an equilibrium between two of those, the other one can be slightly displaced. Because, talk about this transient spaces that we are, you're never going to perfect all three. There will be times where maybe all three are going smoothly, but you're never going to achieve that nirvana of that equilibrium for a consistent, long-term period. It just isn't going to happen.
No, it's not. And I mean, to think of these extreme examples and to come to your triad, imagine that you've quit your job and you've made £1 million and you're just sitting at home doing nothing. You're going to be so bored because the other areas of your life are not in equilibrium. Don't get me wrong. I think I'd be all right for 6 months, but then I'd be like, I'm going crazy.
Yeah.
And then if you balance it the other way, you're doing too much work and you're saying, I'm burnt out, I'm tired, I'm stressed. And then you could go to that other corner of your triad, hanging out with all your friends all the time. And you're going to be like, I can't stand these people. I need to meet up. I need some time to rest. And you're right. There is a very fine balance between that triad. And that is exactly what the Dice Man is hitting on. Luke Reinhardt's character is hitting on. Actually, he fulfills all of these roles. And whenever he fulfills one role, another role might be unhappy. And it's striking that balance between the two. And obviously, he does it in a very, very extreme and potentially what I would say is an unhealthy way. I would say it is an unhealthy way to do. And actually, there have been some people who, it is. Well, there's an Australian journalist who went and tried to live like that. And it just completely ruined his life. And I wonder if his attempt to do that was maybe an attempt to not just replicate the attempt of equilibrium in the Dice Man, but also maybe potentially to avoid something. And I think that's something to hit upon as well. If you're looking to make it a change just to avoid something that is difficult, don't do that either. Sometimes you've got to sail through the difficulty.
I almost use that as a yardstick now. If there's a hypothetically two paths, I'm going to choose the path with more discomfort, because actually it will get easier quicker. I've always found, we know this with the gym, healthy eating, everything. I'll just have that snack, or I just won't go to the gym because I don't quite feel like it. It's easier. But actually, the discipline of just turning up, making those changes and going through it, you get so much better, so much quicker. We've talked about that so many times. And health is, that's such an important aspect of it, because that, in a way, that identity of health, I think, is something that a lot of people lack nowadays. We kind of assume that we can just be this job, or we can be running around seeing all these other people in our families and all this. But actually, for you to be able to give out to those people and do all those things, you do have to look after that self in a way as well. So, I guess what I'm encouraging people to do there is to look at their diets, to look at their exercises. We're not talking about necessarily going full David Goggins like we had before, but if you've gone too far with your job,
I've never
maybe
said go for David Goggins. That's all on you, brother.
stay
That
hard.
man is
Stay
extreme. I'm not
hard.
getting involved with that. I don't want any part of that. That's chaotic. That scares me.
But look for that space, right? And that discomfort, because I know I put it off. It's easy at this stage in life, right? 20s through to 30s, relatively good health. You can just push, you can push through, right? You'll be fine. But actually, what I found was that because I was ignoring that, I actually started to fail in the other areas because I was lacking the energy.
I think a clear way to summarize that would be you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to find time to refill what you're doing so that you can pour and pour and pour. And I don't think the society that we live in today is very good at doing that. And I think that's why we see such dramatic burnout across industries, across sectors. Yeah. And I think that's partly why we're seeing such a crisis in sort of people our age and a bit younger who are going, I've just done 8 years of school, I've just done 6 years of training or whatever it is, and I don't know if I can do this role because the demands are so heavy. I read quite a frightening statistic the other day that was 50% of social work graduates don't go on to practice social work. 50%. That's a crazy statistic. Wow. So that's a pretty vital job. And I think that really is a testament to that idea of perhaps we're grilling people too much, and perhaps not just because often I think in our podcast we have a tendency to look very introspectively, and sometimes we have to make a statement on how we're living collectively as a society. And I don't think sort of school, secondary school, college and university, as well as maybe that developmental sector, necessarily gets that balance right. And I was having this conversation with Jess as well about how much the NHS actually profits off of clinicians' free time. You would be shocked to know about how much work we do sort of in our own time, just because that's what the demand is. And if we didn't do that, not just me, but other clinicians, and I'm sure even in your company you had that, if you didn't do that sort of bit of unpaid work, it would come to the ground, it would crumble.
So true. So true. And that only gets worse in my view the higher you go up. There's always this kind of exponential curve I found in my industry, and I'm sure it probably resonates in others, where your time input correlates to your output in terms of money coming in. But it gets to a point where that actually gets skewed a little bit because you have to do all this extracurricular stuff just to be able to maintain that pressure that you're building. And there is a lot of pressure, I think, in a way, for you to then let it creep into those other aspects of your life. And therefore your free time in other areas that we've just been talking about is taken up. But I wanted to go back to your point there. I mean, that's a shocking statistic around the 50% of not going in, once they practice. But there's also
of social workers not practicing.
Not practicing. That's wild. But I think there's another message tucked within that for other people, right? Is that your degree doesn't define you either. Your education doesn't define you either, right? I look at it, and I've talked to you about this before openly. I look at things in chapters. It's not your book. Whatever happened was not your book. It's not pre-written, right? It's a chapter. And actually, you can close that chapter. It's okay. You can close. You can pivot. You can move away. You don't have to. Just because you've gone and spent 5 years doing something doesn't mean you have to stay there, right? The best time to start was 5 years ago and realising you didn't want it, but actually you've gone through it. So the best time to stop is now.
The chapter metaphor that we're going for there. Just think about Natasha Bedingfield's Unwritten. Release your inhibitions. Feel the rain on your skin. Your book's not written. Cue the playlist. But it does remind me of a parable. I think I heard this a long time ago, a really, really long time ago. It might be my mum that said it. But she told me this story about stars. And she said there were a collection of 5 stars, and every year they would shine brightly. Now, one day, one star gets the compliment from a passing meteor. Your light is beautiful. It's amazing. And that star really took that on board. And every single time that meteor passed, which was quite regularly, it would shine brighter and brighter and brighter. And all the other stars would warn, a star that burns twice as bright only burns for half as long, and this star ignored it. And eventually what happened was it began to dwindle because it couldn't keep burning up. And I think people are exactly the same. If you're in a role and you're trying to amalgamate with the accolades of the role with yourself to validate yourself, you're going to burn yourself out.